flows in terms of the water management system across the nation. In terms of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, our role is as set out here. The authority itself is made up of a chair, the chief executive, and 4 expertise-based members, supported by in the region of 250 staff. Our role is to prepare the Basin Plan, accredit water resource plans, establish a water rights information service. There's a whole series of activities in terms of gathering information about the basin through measurement and monitoring. There's a whole activity around community engagement, and we also absorb the historical functions of the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, and that includes the delivery of shared NRM programmes, managing and operating the river system itself to ensure the delivery of water. That seems like a very short list. I can assure you, as with any statement of roles, the devil is in the detail. We're still trying to unpack exactly what that list actually means for us. In terms of governance, in broad terms, the new arrangements, we now report to the Minister for Climate Change and Water, particularly on basin planning, and on joint NRM programmes and managing the water shares and operation of the river to Ministerial Council. This perhaps looks like a fairly complex governance arrangement, but it's a reflection of the changing role where some of the functions, particularly basin planning, will now be done in a single integrated way for the basin as a whole, whereas other arrangements will continue to be run as joint programmes. And again, we're still working through how these arrangements will pan out. Central to the challenge of bringing the basin back to sustainability is the concept of the Basin Plan. This is a key element of the Water Act, and we have a requirement to prepare a basin plan by mid-2011. It will be a legislative instrument, and it will effectively be the mechanism that will drive the whole process of bringing the basin back to sustainability. It will have to be integrated, considering issues from water availability through water quality to the whole question of environmental use of water to critical human needs. The Basin Plan itself, within the context of the Act, there are 14 elements of mandatory content. First and foremost is actually just a description of the water resources, both surface and groundwater. And it's interesting to note that this is the first occasion at which both surface and groundwater have been brought together at a basin scale and actually have been looked at in terms of how they are used, in terms of conjunctive use, and also in terms of the interaction between surface and groundwater. We also have a requirement to consider environmentally sustainable diversion limits. So it's the amount of water that can actually be taken in a sustainable fashion. So again, looking at the historical record and also projecting that into the future in terms of predictability of future water availability. There are also some temporary diversion provisions. Essentially, it's to ease the transition from the current arrangements into the new arrangements. Temporary provisions can be provided over a period of up to 5 years. There are also a whole range of issues that we have to identify in terms of risks to the water resources and strategies that we might deploy to manage those. That could be interception activity, climate change, changing land use, and also the risk that may come as a result of the limits on our knowledge. At the end of the day, while there is much known about the basin, there remains much that is not known about the basin as a whole. There is also a requirement to actually specify the outcomes and the objectives that we are trying to achieve, and these could be environmental outcomes and so on, water quality, salinity, diversion limits, and also trading outcomes. There is a desire to drive greater trade within the marketplace, so clearly the plan will actually have to span fairly broadly. In terms of the other elements, we have to identify methods for assessing compliance with long-term average sustainable diversion limits. At the end of the day, when the plan comes into being, we then have to go into a process of making sure that it is established and that activity on the ground complies with that. It requires an environmental watering plan, water quality and salinity management, state water resource plan requirements. At the end of the day, there will be state water resources which will drill down to the more local issues. So the Basin Plan is basin-wide. We'll have another tier of plans below those developed by the jurisdictions, which will set out the more localised issues. The whole issue of trading rules that may apply. That might actually be restrictions, barriers to trade, trading areas, and a whole series of activities around information and reporting. We get right down into things like the issues of sharing, reductions in water availability, critical human needs for the system, and a whole monitoring and evaluation programme. And we have 2 years to put all of that together as a package which will then be adopted. In terms of the basis of the plan, try to conceptualise the plan into a simple diagram. But we also have to, if we start on the left-hand side, we effectively have to determine the actual amount of water that is available. And at the same time, we also, on the other hand, have to identify the environmental assets that we're actually looking to protect. And from these two elements, we will actually then be able to work out how much water is required to meet the environmental water requirements. That will then determine how much water remains for other uses. So only then can we look at consumptive use, broader natural resources management and social issues, and it's in that environment that we'll actually define the environmental watering plans themselves, the water quality and salinity management plan, and the sustainable diversion limits. Those will apply once the environmental issues have been considered. Out of that will come a proposed basin plan, and as part of that, there is a requirement on the authority to actually prepare a socio-economic analysis to look at the implications from a socio-economic point of view. Quite clearly, the new regime will differ from the old, and as a result there will be consequences for the 3 million people who live and work in the basin. But it's also important to note that the Water Act is very explicit. It actually demands that the basin plan uses the best available scientific knowledge and socio-economic analysis. So it is very much being figured as a scientifically based plan, as opposed to some of the historical efforts through a joint arrangement where the science was not always to the forefront of the decisions. In terms of timelines, we're currently in phase 1. Obviously the authority only came into being on the 15th of December last year. So at this point in time we're very much in the planning stage. We have a draft concept statement, and we expect to release that in the near future. The proposed basin plan will be available by mid-2010, and then we then move into an extensive consultation phase 3. All things being equal, we would expect the basin plan itself to be adopted mid-2011. The community, we certainly expect a very significant community engagement phase throughout this. Given the significance of the basin and the fact that everyone has a view on how it should be managed, we expect a lot of actual commentary on this. Every submission we receive will have to be published on our website, including our response to it. At this point in time, we're expecting about 30,000 individual submissions, every one of which will have to be analysed, responded to and published, in addition to changing the plan if that is warranted on the basis of those. So we actually anticipate a fairly lengthy exercise.